Jake Saunders had always been a cowboy at heart, raised on the open plains where the sky stretched wide and the world felt free. He had the rugged look of someone who had spent most of his life riding horses, working cattle and surviving the tough, unpredictable nature of the West. His face was weathered from the harsh sun, his hands calloused from years of labor. He was used to hard work and an even harder life. That day, however, he wasn't thinking about cattle or dusty trails. He was just passing through a small trading post along his way to another job. The small settlement, nestled at the edge of the frontier, was bustling with activity. Cowboys, traders, and travelers filled the streets, moving back and forth with the hurry of people who always had somewhere to be. The air was thick with dust, the smell of leather and horses, and the sounds of laughter and shouting. Jake, with his worn leather boots and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his sharp blue eyes, walked into the post with one thing on his mind: supplies. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he didn't want to stay long. The West was a place for people who kept moving, and Jake had learned long ago not to linger. But as he entered the trading post, something caught his eye. A girl sitting quietly just outside the main area. She wasn't like the women Jake had seen in town. She wasn't standing by the barrels of goods or calling out to men to buy anything. Instead, she was sitting alone, her back straight, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a kind of calmness that immediately stood out to him. She looked out of place, almost like a piece of stillness in a world of chaos. Her dark hair was braided neatly over her shoulder, and her simple dress, made of rough fabric, seemed far less extravagant than the colorful clothes worn by the other women in town. Curiosity tugged at Jake's mind, but he didn't want to stare. He had no reason to be interested in her, but as he glanced toward the merchant booth, he overheard a conversation that made him stop in his tracks. A man standing at the booth was talking to the merchant, mentioning that the girl sitting by herself was available for purchase. At first, Jake didn't fully understand. Purchase? He blinked, his attention caught by the words. But the merchant continued, speaking as though it was a simple fact, as if he was describing a horse or a piece of equipment. Jake wasn't sure why, but he felt a strange discomfort settle in his chest. The merchant was explaining that for a small price, $2 to be exact, the girl would be at the buyer's service for the day. It wasn't a transaction Jake was used to hearing about, especially not in this town, but it wasn't entirely uncommon in a world where survival often meant making difficult choices. The merchant went on to describe the girl as someone who could assist with tasks, accompany men, and, in a way, provide the comfort that many men who passed through these rough parts sought. But Jake wasn't interested in what the merchant was saying. Something about it didn't sit right with him. A gut feeling that made him pause before jumping into any action. He kept looking over at the girl. She was still sitting quietly, but now her eyes were on him too. They locked for a brief moment, and Jake felt a strange sensation, like a pull that reached deep into him, unsettling him more than he expected. Her gaze wasn't shy or intimidated like many women's might have been in a place like this. No, her eyes were sharp, calculating even, like she knew more than she let on. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a certain confidence in it. Something powerful and unspoken passed between them. Without fully knowing why, Jake found himself walking toward her. It was as if some invisible force was guiding his feet. His boots crunched on the dirt as he made his way to where she sat, and as he approached, the girl's gaze never wavered. There was no hint of fear in her eyes, no sign of weakness, just that same intense calm. She was watching him, waiting for something, perhaps a sign, perhaps a test. When Jake reached her, he found that he couldn't bring himself to speak at first. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure of what to say. He had seen many things in his life, things that would have made most men flinch or turn away. But there was something about this girl, about her stillness, about the way she held herself, that made him question the way he had been living. "Are you the one they're talking about?" Jake finally asked, his voice rough, his hand running over his stubbled chin. She didn't answer immediately, and for a moment he wondered if she even understood him. But then slowly she looked up at him, her dark eyes piercing him like two sharp stones. It was then that she spoke, and her voice, though quiet, carried an undeniable strength. "You'll regret this," she said, her words slow and measured. "I won't obey." Jake blinked, taken aback. Her words weren't what he expected. They weren't pleading or resigned, they were firm, direct. There was no fear in her voice, just a steady certainty. She wasn't offering him any comfort, no softening of the situation. She was telling him plainly that things wouldn't be easy, that she wasn't going to follow anyone's orders. The statement hung in the air, and Jake felt something deep inside him stir. What did she mean? Was she warning him, or was she challenging him? And why did it feel like such a heavy statement even though she spoke so calmly? Without really thinking, Jake found himself nodding, almost as though he understood something he hadn't before. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, with a quiet power that couldn't be ignored. Jake was used to taking control of his surroundings, used to being the one who called the shots. But this girl, Ayanna, the merchant had called her, was different. She wasn't a woman who would simply be swept along with the current. No, she seemed to carry a world inside her. A world that was clearly far beyond what he understood. He wasn't sure why, but instead of feeling anger or frustration at her defiance, Jake felt drawn to her, as though this moment was something that would change him forever. And as the silence stretched between them, he realized that whatever happened next, he wasn't going to forget this girl. Ayanna wasn't just someone who would be a passing part of his journey. She was already shaping it in ways he didn't fully understand. Jake didn't say anything in response to her warning. He simply stood there watching her, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. For the first time in a long while, he was unsure of what he wanted. He had come to the trading post for supplies for nothing more than to move along to the next town. But now, he was standing before a girl who had already begun to change the course of his life with just a few words. Without another word, Jake turned and walked back to the merchant. But even as he moved, his mind remained fixed on Ayanna. He had paid $2 for her company, but in truth, it felt as though she had already paid something far greater. She had planted a seed of uncertainty in him, a seed that would soon grow into something neither of them could predict. As Jake gathered his things and prepared to leave the trading post, one thought stayed with him, Ayanna's warning. You'll regret this. And for the first time in a long time, Jake wondered if he would. Jake had always thought he was a man who knew how to get what he wanted. The rugged West was a place where strength, grit, and determination meant everything. If you wanted something, you had to take it, whether it was land, cattle, or a man's respect. But nothing in his life had prepared him for Ayanna. After paying the $2, Jake had expected their time together to be straightforward. He was a man of few words, someone who appreciated silence and the company of his horse more than long conversations. So when the merchant handed him a small sack of provisions and nodded towards Ayanna, Jake assumed their journey would be as simple as any other. He had paid, she was there to accompany him, and that was that. But Ayanna, from the very start, had different ideas. As they began to walk towards the edge of the town, Jake could feel her eyes on him. There was a strange tension in the air, as if every step was heavy with meaning. She didn't speak, didn't make any effort to engage, and didn't even look at him directly. Instead, she kept her eyes focused ahead, walking at a steady pace, her movements graceful yet deliberate. Jake, trying to break the silence, spoke first. He cleared his throat, offering a simple greeting. "Name's Jake," he said, his voice rough from years of use. "Where you from?" Ayanna didn't reply immediately, and for a moment Jake thought she hadn't heard him. But then, after a long pause, she answered in a low, measured tone, "I am from the land of my people, the land that was once ours." Her words caught Jake off guard, and he looked at her sideways. There was a quiet pride in her voice, and he could sense that she wasn't interested in small talk. She wasn't the kind of person who shared details of her life easily. That was fine with Jake. He wasn't one for endless chatter either. But as they continued walking, Jake found himself growing frustrated. Ayanna refused to follow his commands. When he told her to pick up the pace, she didn't quicken her steps. When he told her to walk around a small creek, she simply stepped right through it, not caring about the wetness of her dress or the mud on her shoes. It wasn't just that she was disobedient. It was the fact that she seemed completely unaffected by anything he said or did. She wasn't trying to get under his skin, but she was in her own way, making it clear that she wasn't going to be controlled by him or anyone else. Jake had been a cowboy all his life, and in his world things went a certain way. People listened, followed orders, and worked hard. There were no questions about authority, but Ayanna wasn't like any woman he had known. She wasn't scared to stand her ground, and that was something that made Jake uneasy. "Why don't you follow my lead?" he finally asked, trying to hide the irritation in his voice. "I'm not here to make things difficult for you, you know." Ayanna didn't flinch. She stopped walking for a moment and turned to look at him, her eyes steady and unwavering. Her expression was calm, yet there was an intensity behind it, a quiet force that Jake couldn't ignore. "I don't follow orders," she said simply. "I walk my own path as I always have. No one tells me what to do." Jake was taken aback. He had heard people talk about the pride of the native tribes, but this was different. It wasn't just pride, there was something deeper in her words, something that told him Ayanna had been through much more than he could ever imagine. She wasn't just resisting him because she didn't like him. She was resisting because that was how she had learned to survive. But Jake wasn't a man who easily gave up. He tried again, speaking more gently this time. "Look, I paid for your company. You're here to help me. If we're going to travel together, we need to work as a team. Can't have you making things harder than they need to be." Ayanna didn't respond at first. She simply picked up the pace, leaving Jake behind for a few steps. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but there was still an edge to it. "I am not here to help you," she said, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I am here because I have no choice, just as you have no choice but to see me for what I am." Jake frowned. What did she mean by that? Was she saying that she had been forced into this situation? Or was there something else behind her words? But before he could ask, Ayanna was already moving again, her steps steady and sure. For the rest of the day, their journey was quiet, punctuated only by the occasional sound of Ayanna's footsteps or the distant calls of birds. Jake tried to engage her again, asking about her life, but she only responded in brief, cryptic sentences. The more he tried to understand her, the less he seemed to know. As night began to fall, they set up camp by a small stream. Jake had spent enough time on the trail to know how to make a fire and prepare a simple meal, and he didn't expect Ayanna to help. She sat by the edge of the water, her back to him, staring into the darkening horizon. Jake had his back turned, stirring the pot over the fire, but his mind was still on Ayanna. Her calm resistance, her steady gaze, it all seemed like a mystery he couldn't quite solve. What kind of person could live like this? Where did her strength come from? "You ever tell anyone what you've been through?" Jake asked as he turned to look at her. The question was more out of curiosity than anything else, but he felt a strange urge to understand her better. Ayanna didn't turn around, but she answered, "There is no need to speak of it. Some things are better left unspoken." Jake didn't push her further. He understood that some people carried their pasts in silence, that there were wounds too deep to share with anyone. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ayanna than she was letting on. As they ate in silence, Jake's frustration began to mix with something else. He didn't know if it was admiration or something more complicated, but he knew one thing for certain. Ayanna wasn't someone he could control. She wasn't just a woman to be ordered around. She was someone who held her own, someone who had the strength to refuse to bend. He thought about her words earlier. "I won't obey." They weren't a challenge, not exactly. They were a statement of truth. Ayanna didn't need to obey anyone because she had learned long ago that to survive, she had to rely on herself. She wasn't interested in fitting into the world Jake understood, and that made her both intriguing and frustrating. As the fire crackled and the stars began to shine overhead, Jake realized that Ayanna's defiance was more than just an inconvenience. It was a lesson he wasn't sure he was ready to learn, but one that would change him in ways he couldn't yet understand. And as the night stretched on, Jake found himself wondering, what would happen if he stopped trying to make her obey? What if, instead, he just let her walk her own path and saw where it led? For the first time, he wasn't sure what to expect next. Jake didn't know what to make of Ayanna. Every day she seemed more like a riddle, one that he couldn't solve no matter how hard he tried. The journey, which he had hoped would be nothing more than a quick trip to the next town, had turned into something far more complicated. It was clear that Ayanna wasn't going to just follow along quietly. She wasn't the kind of person who accepted things at face value, and that was both maddening and intriguing to Jake. At first, Jake had thought that if he just gave her a few tasks, she'd fall into the routine, and they could both get along well enough. But Ayanna refused to be treated like one of the men's workers back at the trading post. She wasn't going to chop wood just because he asked or carry his supplies without a word. Every time Jake gave her an instruction, she either ignored him or did things her own way. She didn't care that he was the one paying for her presence. It wasn't about that to her. One morning, Jake woke up early as he always did to tend to the horses and start the fire. The sky was still dark, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of a twig. Ayanna was already awake. She was sitting by the edge of the stream, her legs crossed beneath her, her eyes closed in quiet concentration. Jake had never seen anyone so calm, especially out here in the wilderness, where most people would be focused on survival. He was used to seeing people move with urgency, to see them act quickly to gather supplies and prepare for the day ahead. But not Ayanna. She didn't hurry. She didn't stress. She simply existed, completely at peace with herself and the world around her. It was something that made Jake uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. After a while, Jake decided to try something different. Instead of giving her commands, he would try to speak to her. Maybe, just maybe, if he took the time to understand her, she might start to trust him a little more. It wasn't about owning her or controlling her. It was about figuring out who she was. "I've been wondering," Jake started, breaking the silence as he finished saddling his horse. "Why don't you tell me about your people? Where do you come from?" Ayanna opened her eyes slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to speak. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were still as intense as ever, but this time there was a softness in them. "There is no need to speak of it," she said quietly, the tone of her voice no longer distant but more thoughtful. "Some things are meant to be remembered quietly, within the heart." Jake wasn't sure what she meant by that. "But don't you ever want to tell your story? I mean, people should know what's happened to you, to your people. You shouldn't carry all that alone." Ayanna stared at him for a long moment. Jake thought she might be annoyed, but instead she gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Then she spoke again, but this time, her voice carried a deep sadness that Jake hadn't heard before. "The world doesn't want to hear our story," she said softly. "And maybe that's a good thing. We've been ignored, oppressed, and forgotten. To speak of it only brings more pain. I carry my people's story in my heart. It is enough for me." Jake felt something inside him shift. He realized that Ayanna's refusal to share her past wasn't because she didn't want to. It was because she had learned long ago that not everyone would listen. In a world that had stolen so much from her and her people, silence had become a form of strength. He didn't speak for a while after that. The weight of her words settled in his chest, and for the first time, Jake saw Ayanna in a different light. She wasn't just someone who didn't follow orders. She was someone who carried a heavy burden, one that didn't need to be shared with the world. It was something private, something sacred. Over the next few days, their journey grew more difficult. The terrain was getting harsher and the weather had started to change. The days grew hotter and the nights colder. But no matter how tough things got, Ayanna remained unchanged. She walked with a steady pace, never rushing, never complaining. She seemed to find peace in the harshest conditions. Jake, on the other hand, found himself growing more frustrated as he tried to adjust to the way Ayanna did things. One afternoon, as they were crossing a particularly rocky patch of the trail, he asked her to help him move a fallen log that was blocking their path. It wasn't heavy, but it required teamwork. Ayanna stopped for a moment, watching him as he struggled with the log. Then she simply shook her head and moved around the obstacle, not saying a word. Jake stared after her, his patience wearing thin. "Ayanna, come on," he called out, his voice carrying a hint of frustration. "We need to work together if we're going to make it through this." "Why do you insist on doing everything by yourself?" Ayanna stopped, but only for a moment. She turned to face him, her expression calm, her stance unbothered. "I have been alone for a long time," she said quietly. "I do not need help from anyone who does not respect me for who I am." Jake's mouth went dry. Her words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't just refusing to help. She was refusing to be controlled, to be treated as less than she was. In that moment, Jake realized something important. Ayanna didn't need him or anyone else. She had learned long ago how to survive on her own, and that made her stronger than most people he had known. For the rest of the day, Jake said nothing. He followed her in silence, unsure of what to say. They made camp by nightfall, and once again the fire crackled between them as the stars above them twinkled. This time, Jake didn't try to talk to Ayanna. He didn't feel the need to. Instead, he sat back and watched her. There was something powerful in her quiet strength, something that pulled at him, even though he didn't fully understand it. As the firelight danced on her face, Jake felt a deep respect for her, an admiration for someone who could live with so much independence and strength. He realized that his frustration wasn't about her defiance. It was about the way she made him question everything he had ever believed. She wasn't like the women he had known. She didn't follow the rules he had grown up with. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. That night, as he lay under the stars, Jake found himself thinking more about Ayanna. She wasn't just a native girl he had met on the road. She was someone who had survived things he couldn't even begin to understand. She had a history that wasn't hers alone to carry. Jake wasn't sure where their journey would take them next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't the same person he had been when they first crossed paths. Ayanna's refusal to obey wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was a reminder that some people weren't meant to be controlled. Some people were meant to be respected for who they were, no matter how different they seemed. Jake wasn't sure what would happen when their journey finally ended, but he had a feeling it would change him forever. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to reach the end. As the days passed, Jake started to notice something changing within himself. It wasn't just his growing respect for Ayanna, although that was certainly part of it, but it was more like a shift deep inside his core. He had always thought of himself as a man who understood the world, a man who knew how things worked. But Ayanna, with her quiet strength and her defiance, had begun to make him question everything he thought he knew. He had spent years following the rules of the Wild West. Hard work, respect for authority, and taking what you needed to survive had always been his guiding principles. But Ayanna didn't fit into any of those categories. She didn't need to follow the rules to survive. She had her own way of doing things, a way that didn't involve anyone else's approval. And every day that passed, Jake realized more and more how little he understood about her world. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jake found himself staring at Ayanna, lost in thought. She was sitting across from him, her back straight, her eyes flickering with the reflection of the flames. It had become a habit of his, watching her in the quiet moments when she wasn't speaking, when she wasn't challenging him or forcing him to think harder than he ever had. She had said very little over the past few days. Ayanna was always quiet, but lately her silence had felt heavier, as if there was something she was carrying inside her that she wasn't ready to share. Jake had tried to ask her more questions about her life, about her people, but each time, she had simply responded with the same calm assurance. Some things are better left unsaid. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Ayanna was hiding a part of herself from him, something deep and painful. The more she held back, the more he wanted to know. But he didn't push her. There was something in the way she carried herself that told him she wasn't ready to open up. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars filled the sky above them, Jake found himself staring at the flickering flames. He wasn't thinking about cattle or his next job or the money he'd earned. He was thinking about Ayanna, about her strength, about how despite everything she had been through, she remained unbroken. Ayanna, he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the night air. I don't know what happened to you, but I think I understand now. You've had to fight your whole life, haven't you? Ayanna didn't answer right away. She just stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. Jake wasn't sure if she had even heard him, but after a long pause, she finally spoke. I have fought, yes, she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Jake's chest tighten. I have fought for my people, for my land, for my freedom, but I don't carry the past with me like a burden. I carry it like a memory, one that shapes who I am but doesn't control me. Jake sat silently for a moment, letting her words settle. He had always thought of survival as a struggle, something that took strength and effort. But Ayanna's words made him see it differently. To her, survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about remembering who you were, where you came from, and holding on to that even when the world tried to strip it away. You don't forget, Jake said, more to himself than to her. You don't let the world change who you are. No, Ayanna replied. The world can change everything around me, but it cannot change who I am inside. Her words hung in the air like a quiet truth that Jake couldn't escape. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in making things happen, in taking control of the world around him. But Ayanna wasn't like that. She wasn't trying to control anything. She wasn't trying to fight the world. She was just being herself. And in doing so, she was teaching Jake that sometimes the greatest strength was in accepting who you were and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. For the next few days, Jake couldn't stop thinking about Ayanna's words. Every time he looked at her, he saw something new, something that went beyond her defiance, beyond her refusal to obey him. He saw a person who had endured hardship, who had lost everything and still managed to find peace. Ayanna wasn't just a woman who wouldn't be controlled. She was a woman who had learned to live on her own terms, to survive on her own terms. That realization shook Jake more than anything else. It wasn't just that Ayanna was different. It was that she had a wisdom he hadn't understood before. She wasn't trying to change him. She wasn't trying to make him see things her way. She was simply being herself. And in doing so, she had made him question his own life, his own choices. One afternoon, as they rode through a wide stretch of grassland, Jake found himself looking at Ayanna in a new light. She was riding beside him, her horse moving at a steady pace, her gaze forward. Her quiet confidence was almost like a shield, and for the first time Jake realized that the shield wasn't just for protecting herself. It was for protecting what she believed in, protecting her own sense of identity. Jake tried to speak to her again, but this time, it wasn't about survival or the journey ahead. This time, he simply wanted to know more about who she was, not just as a person, but as someone who had seen the world in ways he never could. "What was it like?" Jake asked, his voice hesitant. "What was it like before everything changed? Before you had to leave your home?" Ayanna didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Jake thought he had asked the wrong question. But then she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "It was beautiful," she said, her words like a distant memory. "The land was ours. We lived in harmony with it. We were connected to it. We knew it and it knew us. But then, the world came to take it from us, and we had to fight because if we didn't, we would have lost everything. Not just land, but our way of life." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard stories of the native people being pushed from their land, forced to give up their homes and their culture. But hearing it from Ayanna, hearing the pain in her voice, made it feel real in a way he hadn't imagined. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to bring up bad memories." Ayanna didn't look at him, but her voice softened. "The memories are there whether you speak of them or not," she said. "It's not the past that hurts. It's what we lost along the way." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sound of their horses' hooves on the ground was the only noise that filled the silence between them. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, but it also felt heavy. Jake realized that Ayanna wasn't just carrying the weight of her past. She was carrying the weight of an entire history, one that had been lost, forgotten, and taken away by forces much greater than herself. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with colors of gold and orange, Jake looked over at Ayanna again. She was still looking ahead, her face serene, but now there was something different about her. She wasn't just a woman who had been forced into a life of survival. She was someone who had seen the worst of the world and had somehow managed to hold on to who she was, no matter what had been taken from her. And for the first time, Jake realized that this journey with Ayanna wasn't just about him. It was about learning. It was about understanding the strength it took to survive when everything was stacked against you. And maybe, just maybe, it was about finding the courage to stop fighting the world and start accepting it. The days were growing longer as Jake and Ayanna continued their journey together. The trail they traveled was becoming more difficult, and the weather was as unpredictable as the West itself. But despite all the challenges, there was something unspoken between them, something that had shifted in the past weeks. Jake no longer saw Ayanna as just the native girl he had paid for at the trading post. She wasn't an object or someone to be controlled. She was a person with her own story, her own strength, and a depth that Jake couldn't quite fully grasp but felt drawn to. The journey had started with a simple transaction, but now it had become something more. A shared experience, a learning process. Jake had gone from being frustrated with her defiance to feeling a quiet respect for her. Ayanna had made him question his own way of life, his beliefs, and his understanding of what it meant to truly survive in a world that often seemed designed to break you. One evening, as they camped near a small river, the fire crackling softly in front of them, Jake looked over at Ayanna, who was sitting by the water, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. The night was peaceful, the stars spread out like a blanket across the sky. There was no rush, no urgency. The world was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt calm. "You've taught me more than I ever thought I'd learn," Jake said, breaking the silence. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you before." Ayanna didn't turn to look at him, but her voice when she spoke was soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. I am not here to teach you anything, she said. I am here because it is where I must be. My path brought me to you, just as your path brought you to me. Jake thought about that for a moment. He had always been the one to decide where his life would take him. His path had always seemed clear. Work hard, ride fast, keep moving forward. But now it didn't feel so simple. There was something about Ayana's words that made him reconsider his whole way of thinking. For most of his life, Jake had thought of himself as in control. He made the decisions. He set the pace. But Ayana had shown him that sometimes life wasn't about control. Sometimes it was about acceptance. Accepting that you can't always choose your path, but you can choose how you walk it. There's a lot I don't understand, Jake admitted, his voice quieter now. A lot about you, about your people. But I want to understand. I want to know why you've had to live the way you do. Why you've had to fight so much. Ayana turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his in the flickering firelight. There was a moment of silence before she spoke again, her words coming slowly like she was choosing them carefully. We fight because it is in us to survive, she said, her voice steady and calm. Our people have always fought. Against the land, against those who would take from us, against those who sought to erase us. But the fight is not only about survival. It is about remembering who we are, who we've always been. The world can take everything from us, but it cannot take our spirit. It cannot take our memory. Jake felt something stir inside him, something deep. Ayana's words weren't just about her people. They were about all people who had ever been forced to fight for what they believed in, for their land, for their culture. It wasn't just survival. It was about identity, about holding on to who you were, even when the world seemed determined to make you forget. I've spent most of my life thinking about survival in terms of strength, Jake said, his voice thoughtful, about how much you can take, how hard you can work, how far you can push yourself. But what you're saying, it's not just about strength, is it? It's about keeping something of yourself, even when everything around you is trying to take it away. Ayana nodded slowly, her gaze turning back to the fire. That is true. Survival is not only in the body, it is in the spirit. And when you lose that, when you forget who you are, it's like being lost in the world. Jake didn't know what to say. He had always believed that strength was something physical, that it was about how much you could endure. But now, as he sat across from Ayana, he realized how wrong he had been. Strength wasn't just about bearing through hardship. It was about keeping a part of yourself intact, even when the world tried to take it away. The conversation lingered in Jake's mind long after they had gone to sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about what Ayana had said. He had spent so much time pushing forward, focused on the next step, the next job, the next payday. But now he was beginning to see that there was something more important than the destination. It was the journey, yes, but it was also about knowing who you were as you moved through it. It was about keeping that part of yourself that was untouched by the outside world, no matter how hard life tried to shape you. The next day, as they continued their journey, Jake found that he was no longer focused on the road ahead. He was more focused on the moment, on the present. For the first time, he wasn't trying to get somewhere. He was simply walking alongside Ayana, learning from her, watching her, and realizing how much there was to appreciate in the world around him. It wasn't long before they came to a small town, a place where they would part ways. Jake felt a twinge of uncertainty as they approached. He had never expected this journey to change him so much, but it had. Ayana had shown him a different way of seeing the world, a way that didn't focus on control or survival, but on memory, on identity, and on strength of spirit. As they stopped near the edge of town, Jake turned to Ayana. I don't know what to say, he said quietly, his voice hesitant. But I won't forget what you've taught me. I won't forget you. Ayana looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment there was silence. Then without a word she nodded. It wasn't a nod of agreement, but one of understanding. You may not need to remember me, she said softly, but remember what I've shown you. What you keep inside is more important than anything you can hold outside. With that, she turned and began walking toward the town, leaving Jake standing by the edge of the road. He watched her walk away, a sense of loss settling in his chest. But it wasn't a sad loss. It was the kind of loss that came with growth. The kind that came with the realization that you had been changed for the better. As Ayana disappeared into the distance, Jake realized something. The journey he had taken with her had been more than just a chance encounter. It had been a lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. And in that lesson, Jake found the most valuable thing he had ever learned. That strength wasn't about fighting to control the world around you. It was about remembering who you were, no matter what the world tried to take.